How do art galleries in Boston support artists and foster engagement in social and political change? Is all art political? Keep listening for insight from a Dorchester based art curator on this, her artistry, and more. In this episode, we're talking about the curation and centering of art for social change in Boston. Jessica Hernandez is here today with me, Edis, for this episode of Iris FM. Jessica is the managing director of Unbound Visual Arts, a DJ, producer, sound artist, and event programmer. To start, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your artistic interests?
So, in terms of visual art at UVA, my interests are in sculpture and installation. I'm really interested in artists who utilize found objects um, and kind of harsh materials. Like, I'm interested in people who use construction materials or things related to architecture. I'm really interested in textures as well. Um, I'm interested in people who explore things that maybe are uncomfortable or somber or melancholic or kind of dark, um, things that have to do with fragmentation, deconstruction. Um, I think my interest in that is related to my interest in music. So I make electronic music. I'm really interested in techno and also experimental music that incorporates found sounds and samples and some archival sounds. And I think in terms of music, I'm almost interested in the same exact thing that I am in terms of visual art. So sounds that are a bit darker, sounds that are industrial, or things that like capture the sounds of industry, building, construction. Um, Again, things that are kind of terrifying, maybe anxiety inducing, things that explore discomfort. And I think maybe that just comes from me, like that's my interest in aesthetics. But yeah, I like people and things and art that I don't know, is not things that are not scared to explore like kind of darker themes, and maybe uncomfortable themes. Um, and things that I guess are interested in like the sounds of objects, the sounds of like inanimate objects and materials, rather than things that are more representational or seem like they come from real life and are recognizable and familiar.
Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the organizations that you're part of? You can give a little bit of like an overview of both like Unbound and Transporter and then some of the other stuff you do, because I know that you do a lot of stuff.
Sure, yeah. So UVA, Unbound Visual Arts, is a nonprofit arts organization located in Brighton. We've been around since 2012, and our current gallery space in Brighton is where we relocated in 2023. Our work is really interested in, or our mission really is to showcase the work of artists that are based in Boston. And in terms of all of our exhibitions and the artists that we invite to present their work, we're really interested in things that explore social, political, or environmental issues. So, for example, we've done a lot of things about climate crisis and climate catastrophe. We were also interested in more political things. So we recently had an exhibition that featured 53 Palestinian artists, artists whether they're based in Palestine or in the diaspora, and that was curated by Joel Toom, Rula Houri, and Heidi Matola. So with everything that we do, we're really interested in just like putting something on that has a meaningful message and is often engaged with the current conditions that we're living under, whether that's fascism, authoritarianism, and other forms of brutality. And we think it's like important to put on work that engages with that. And that's our hope. And outside of that, we also put on performances with Boston-based musicians as well. And that can range from electronic music artists to people who are more interested in maybe contemporary classical or acoustic improvisation. Um, and we also have just implemented an annual residency, so giving artists um, resources and materials, or mostly resources and funds to create new work and use the gallery as a studio space. And in terms of transporter, my friend and I, Aaron Michael Smith, we co-founded that in 2024, and that usually takes place at the Boston Cyber Arts Gallery in Jamaica Plain. And the goal of that is also um, putting on performances and shows for musicians, both local and touring artists. And we usually craft a bill of about 4 artists and yeah, have see their live sets and yeah, just want to be a place for people to showcase what they're working on.
So you mentioned that Unbound really focuses on a lot of arts and exhibitions and programs that focus on social change, political things like that, which I kind of refer to as like engaged art. How do you and the rest of the team keep these lenses of engaged art with local artists centered?
Focusing on local artists to me is almost the easy part, definitely the easy part. Um, and to do that, it involves me like going to different exhibitions that are around or exhibitions that are up at different galleries and nonprofit art spaces, and just trying to like see who's in the show, who's showcasing what kind of work. And it really is just a lot about seeing things, going out and seeing things. Um, Other times, I'm also on different websites that cater to Boston based artists. For example, I often go on the website for the Boston Center for the Arts and just see who has studio space or who's doing what, and learning about artists that way. Other times, it's going through social media and seeing who's engaging with our content, or again, who's showing where at different exhibition spaces and galleries. Other times, it's local artists reaching out to us. So for me, it just involves a bunch of research and looking and yeah, reading and trying to see what people are working on. And then in terms of keeping a focus on engaged art and art that engages with different social or political concerns, sometimes that is challenging um, because it really just comes down to the artists and if they're interested in working on those kinds of things. But yeah, I think it involves a lot of research. And when you do find someone who is working on that, like you go for it, basically.
And just out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on the discussion about whether all art is political or not?
That's a really good question. I would say that yes, all art is political, but I think it's a matter of like how it engages with the political, if at all. So for so like maybe at the start, all art is political because it comes out of real life and doesn't come out of a vacuum. And so in some ways it's often a product or influenced by or shaped by or related to what is going on in the world somehow. And then the other way that I think art is political is, of course, if it directly and overtly engages with different political issues, whether it's things that have happened historically or things that are happening in the present day. And that can range. I guess, like, if we're talking about the US, like, I can imagine, and people definitely are, like, making work that relates to fascism, violence, brutality. gentrification, displacement, genocide. Um, and I think if someone wanted to make the case that not all art is political or that art can be apolitical, I think I would disagree because that is taking like a stance, a stance against politics, which is still related to it.
Yeah, that's kind of very similar to how I feel is like not all art is necessarily meant to be political, but
Mm-hmm.
everyone is influenced by politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, our art is also inspired and influenced by it, even if indirectly or unintentionally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And one of the things I see a lot is like, as you mentioned, like the local part is kind of the easier one, especially in a place like Boston, I think, where there is just like such a rich history of art. But what would you say about the importance of platforming art that is for social change? And why would you say it's valuable to people that might? I see, especially with like the argument of like all art is political, and then it's like, well, then you don't need to like seek it out. But
Mm-hmm.
I think we might both think that it is important to actively seek out this kind of art. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
I think it's important to seek out art that is socially engaged or is concerned with the various conditions that we're living under and often are constrained by. I think it's important to do that because I think visual art is just like any other medium to get to these topics. You know, it is like writing about these topics. It is like making music about these topics. It is like watching a film or a documentary. Like for me, it just seems like another way to get at these things. Um, and like any form of expression or medium, like it has its own like affordances and it has its own possibilities and it also has its own limitations. So I think the interesting thing for me is to just see how people are getting at these various like issues and how they're going about it and how are they representing it, what's their mode of representation. um, and I think it also just offers, it showcases that person's like particular perspective on it and the way that they're seeing it, and what they have to say about it.
Your current exhibit at UVA is Art of Intorsion by Modgrass, which is showing until March 22nd. And in that, we can see some of that harshness that you mentioned as an interest earlier. But I'm curious what particular pieces or concepts drew you to the exhibit, if anything.
Yeah, this is a hard question. I think I was initially, or I was kind of willing to take this exhibition on, because of like its aesthetics and formal properties. So a lot of the pieces are kind of jagged and sharp and twisted and kind of unfurling and like unfurling over itself, and are kind of expanding in really interesting directions, for each of the small sculptures. So I think that's how I was drawn to it initially. But also, I think this kind of gets at the what I think is one of the dominant models of exhibiting in Boston, which is essentially different nonprofit arts organizations that specialize in exhibitions and different art associations and other smallish galleries, whether they might be nonprofits or not, that the model that they're operating on is one of membership, which is different from gallery representation, which is essentially artists are paying to become members, often are paying to become members of these organizations or these groups or collectives or galleries. And so that because they're members, they, have access to exhibiting opportunities, whether it's them getting a solo exhibition or a smaller exhibition with a few other artists, or them submitting their work to group exhibitions that are then juried, which is the verb that I've been seeing a lot, or do see a lot in terms of the model I'm describing. And then they get into the show, which UVA used to have that model, used to have memberships, and Monograss was maybe one of the last people that signed up to be a member. And because we are small and there really is space and access to exhibit your work, he asked us for a solo exhibition. And so we did it. So that, I would say that's like the main impetus of why this exhibition is up right now. And this kind of has been in the works for maybe like 9 or 10 months. So yeah, this is the product of that like long discussion, or yeah, that long process of planning. Um, and so I do like the work. Like I'm into it aesthetically. I'm interested in sculpture. I'm interested in really like strong materials, such as bronze, which is what the sculptures are made out of. But I would say, yeah, for honesty, like it does come from that previous model, which is it works. It's for a specific thing, and I think you have to be accountable and responsible to the people who want to be members, who want to join your organization, who want to show their work. And if that's your mission, I think you have a responsibility to support these people, because that's your goal and that's the work that you aim to do. And you should always support artists.
Yeah, I think it's something really interesting. In some of my other work, I talk a lot about accessibility when it comes to the audience, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
really think I've written or spoken to people very much about accessibility for the artists. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that idea of like a paid membership is really interesting for that.
Yeah, I think exploring that probably helps you get to a lot of different issues. Like, how much are people paying for these memberships? Of course, who has the income to do that? Um, why does one have to pay at all in general? And that's because whatever space you're exhibiting at probably has to pay rent of some kind, or some has some kind of expense, whether that's staff costs or gallery maintenance or just rent. And then it's like once you become a member, depending on how many members, like what actually are your exhibiting opportunities? Is it like one piece per show, or are you getting a solo exhibition? Or like how do these organizations or entities balance all of the people that they are now kind of responsible for, or accountable to, or want to support? Um, and so I think, yeah, I think it's a challenging model. And I think, how do you grow your membership? How do you expand your audience? And like, are you showing new people, or are you showing like the same people? And so those are some of the things that I was thinking about, and the things that I kind of found challenging, which is why UVA has shifted away from that. And I think we're interested in really like supporting artists in a meaningful way. And I think that that happens when it is like doing solo exhibitions, which is really just like when you're working one on one with an artist or a smaller group. Like you can really talk to people and really understand the work, um, and what they're interested in and how they go about producing work and what their approach is and like the different ideas or research that informs their work. You can really get to that because you're having conversations rather than putting on shows that maybe like you just don't have the time or capacity to be talking to 20 people in depth about maybe a couple of pieces, and maybe aren't able to see like the breadth of their work and their whole body of work.
Yeah, I think I really appreciated the exhibits and programming that I've seen at UVA a lot, for a lot of these like very focused exhibitions, especially like ones that are focused on a singular artist.
Mm-hmm.
And previously, like before your current exhibit, you had a collection of Cal Hart's artistry, or art, I guess you could say, called What Could Have Flickered on the Cusp of a Verge of a Reality. And this was a piece that was open to like viewer input and touch, and then was like reset every like 2 weeks roughly, right?
Mhm.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on drawing the viewer into a piece through interaction like this.
Yeah, I think there are different ways to draw a viewer in. And of course, that depends on how the artist decides to do that. For example, I often see artists kind of um, develop prompts and questions um, and ideas to reflect on in their exhibitions, and set up some kind of station where the person that's coming to see the exhibition can engage with those prompts or answer those questions in a very straightforward way. Like sometimes it's a pen and paper. Other times, maybe it's something that you do on a computer or a questionnaire that you fill out or something, of course, that's related to the exhibition. So there are those straightforward ways. Um, but in the case of Cal's work, one, what helps is maybe being very clear about that in terms of the exhibition statement. Like, you are welcome to engage with the work, you're welcome to play with it, move things around, and yeah, engage with it however you see fit. But I think in Cal's case, the way they went about encouraging the viewer to engage with their work, I think was more subtle. And instead of it being organized in a station where it's very clear, um, the suggestion to engage with the work honestly came from the pieces themselves. So the exhibition was made of a bunch of sculptures and found objects and a lot of pieces with hinges. So there were a lot of like cabinet studies or things related to cabinets and things that you had to open up. And I think by having so many pieces that to engage with them required this actual act of opening up, and the pieces very clearly looking closed. I think that was how they went about encouraging people to engage with the exhibition. So it really came from the work itself rather than creating a separate station, which in those other cases, of course, the separate station is related to the exhibition. But I think somehow embedding that idea in the work is pretty powerful. Because although Cal said you can touch everything in the exhibition, like it did take some work to maybe think about like, okay, how would I engage with this piece? Is it something that I can open up? Is it something that I just move to a different position? And so, yeah, I think there was definitely a bit of thinking on the viewer's part to see like, okay, actually, like, how could I do this thing?
Yeah, I always really love art that you can open. When I
Mm-hmm.
was in college, well, I guess I'm technically still in college. When I was in my undergrad, in my dorm room, I would get closer to the end of the year these giant stacks of throwaway like art collection requisition magazines, basically, primarily about like from Latin American artists because that's what I'm particularly interested in. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember one of my favorite cutouts was of a art piece that was a animal hide that had been tattooed to have like that blue china ceramic pattern
Mm-hmm.
style. And this piece was like a big image, and then it folded closed, and so you had to open it, and that was one of the things that like everyone that visited my room would be immediately drawn to and looking
Really?
at.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I always love seeing things that can invite both like a physical action and also reflection and conversation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That also makes me think of the difference between what I described in terms of maybe some exhibitions, like the ask is to write something down and use language to reflect, versus in these two cases that we're pointing out, the piece that you had in your room and also Cal's work, um, it doesn't it doesn't encourage language. It encourages a different kind of engagement, which is like more of a physical thing. And yeah, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I always like, of course, like predominantly a writer, but I
Mm,
do a lot of other things, and the ways in which I can tell the same message in different ways is always really interesting to me.
yeah,
So like, I'm getting a journalism degree, right?
yeah.
Um, but I also have a science degree. That's my undergraduate major.
Hmm.
And then I also did a lot of like art in various mediums in high school and college, and just kind of throughout my entire life. And the same topic can be told in so many different ways depending
Right,
on
yeah.
what you do. Even when you get into like, I used to do traditional dance as well, and a lot of those have really deep meanings. So it's always, it's just a topic that I'm particularly intrigued by, I guess you could
Yeah,
say.
definitely.
And so, speaking of the many different kinds of artistry, we met through music. I believe we met first at a transporter event,
Yeah.
and then there were some events at Unbound, a lot of music events, but also I remember there was that collaboration, I guess you would say, with Bricklet, I believe it was, right?
Yeah.
Which was a really fun event. Which came first? Was it the music or the visual art?
For me,
Yeah,
whoa, music. Music, definitely.
that's what I figured.
Yeah, I can't remember a time where I wasn't wearing headphones and blasting music. Like felt like I came out the womb like doing that. Yeah, so music is definitely my first love. Um, and yeah, I love listening. Like there's so much music out there. Um, yeah, I can't even like describe it. Like I just can't imagine my life not being interested in this. And sometimes I feel like I do question, like, wow, do I really like music? And that's like mostly when I'm preparing like a live set or working on my own productions, and like I hit like an obstacle, and I'm just like, I don't do I even like this? But yeah, every I but every time I make music or listen to a great song or hear something that I've never heard before or find a new artist that I really enjoy, um, yeah, it just reminds me of like how much I enjoy it.
Yeah, I've been getting really, like, I used to listen to like full albums a lot when I was younger, and then I kind of stopped, and I'm trying to get back into it and really
Mm-hmm.
being a lot more intentional about the music I consume,
Mm-hmm.
because I found that I kind of just fell into that like Spotify inspired
Yeah.
putting on like a radio and not even really knowing who these artists are or what's going on. And I can't remember any of the songs that I listened to for the past 4 hours.
Right.
Um, and so I've been like trying to pick albums to listen to, and going through and actually like, do I even like this song? And I was
Yeah.
worried it would make me dislike my music more and make me realize that I was like not as interested in music as I thought I was. And I
Mm-hmm.
realized that I'm actually like more engaged and more interested in music now than I ever have been before.
Mm. And that question of do I even like this song? I think about that a lot, maybe in terms of DJing. Um, and I mostly DJ techno. I yeah, really enjoy it. Um, and I often go through just like hundreds and hundreds of tracks, and sometimes like a track is like okay, like yeah, it's decent, it's like not bad, but when I like stumble upon the things that like I'm really like whoa, like I really like this track, like it almost makes me go back to things that I thought were just okay and try to see like why do I like this other thing so much more, and why did I have a visceral reaction to it where it really made me question like, wow, like this is the type of sound that I like. And so yeah, like figuring out what you like is actually kind of difficult or can be. Yeah, it's cool to craft your taste and just yeah, see what interests you.
Mhm. Yeah, recently we've been listening a lot to Congotronics, which was a debut album from like 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really interesting to listen to. And I've been listening a lot to Black Focus. So those have been like my recent picks,
Nice.
I guess you could say. And I've been trying to like get into genres I don't always listen to,
Mm-hmm.
and really like expanding. Um, but yeah, I was going to ask before I got sidetracked by music, which I always get sidetracked by. I was curious about how you got into visual art and like art curation.
Yeah, so I would say this started when I was in grad school at the University of Virginia, from 2020 to 2022. When I entered into the history program, I thought I was going to continue studying food justice and food sovereignty, and in particular, Black foodways, because I had been doing that since high school, basically, volunteering at like various um, community farms, and different grassroots organizations, and had done that in college too. And so, again, when I entered that program, I thought I was just going to continue doing that. Um, but once I started researching like Black restaurant culture in the 20th century, which I thought was going to be like my focus and what I was going to write the thesis on, that was proving a little bit difficult, and not really pinning out how I expected, which is always the case with research. You know, you come in with a specific kind of question, but that question changes and shifts depending on what you find in archives or what you don't find in archives or how people are describing things historically. Um, so I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Yeah, not what I expected. And also, since I was thinking about this, or I had been thinking about these kinds of questions since high school, I kind of wanted to do something different. Um, and I've always been interested in different kinds of art. Like I'm really into film, of course, really into music. Um, had seen visual art like occasionally. Um, and while I was at UVA, I was also taking a lot of courses in the Caribbean Studies department, and just learning more about the Caribbean and different histories. Um, my mom's from Haiti and my dad's from Honduras, but I was like, yeah, definitely getting into like more Haitian history for sure. And then I think this definitely depends on what Caribbean or what course you take, but I think you can't talk about the Caribbean without talking about poetics and different kinds of art. Um, like all of the ones that I mentioned, like music and different things, and writing and poetry. Um, and so I was really interested in the way that Caribbean studies felt almost like inherently like a cultural history, um, and using different forms of culture to get at the history, which is, yeah, I think maybe an intersection between my interests, which are history in general, but also like culture, media, different forms of expression. And so as I was taking these Caribbean studies courses, I started learning more about Caribbean artists in the 20th century. And then I was reading a lot about Black studies on my own time. And the works that I was reading were also incorporating different forms of culture in their work. And so, yeah, I was also remembering how I like reading about art and reading people's interpretations of art and reading about how people contextualize art. And I thought like, oh, this is like, yeah, pretty fun, pretty cool, and very rigorous and really interesting, and allows you to have different kinds of writing. You can do the historical description, like this thing happened and then this and then this and then this is what the archive has shown, but you can also be very poetic, in terms of like, yeah, but if we look at this cultural artifact this way, like it kind of makes me think it makes us think about this thing differently or in this kind of perspective. So yeah, I think how it came down to it, I was just trying to like blend all my different interests. And I thought visual art was particularly compelling to do so.
And this is not necessarily visual art in the same way we're talking about it. But speaking of Haiti, have you got into like Yanvalu at all?
No.
It's so when I was in college for about a year, I was part of a like drum and dance ensemble
Nice.
called Yanvalu, which was named for a Haitian dance and music style.
Mm.
I think it's like a very beautiful medium that's full of so much meaning, and
Mhm.
dance tells stories so
Mhm.
well, I feel. Um, so I figured I'd just shout it out right now.
Give it a little shout out. Yeah, no, I haven't heard of it, so I'll definitely look that up. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
We talk about like art for social change and community, but there are just so many different ways and different directions art can go in to talk about this social change or be engaged. I'm curious what ways of fostering change in community you find particularly interesting.
I think in terms of in terms of social change, I'm always interested in art that incorporates history and archives. And if we're talking about social change, maybe incorporates histories of protest and histories of resilience, and I guess art that essentially says like we've been here before. Like this is not the first time that it's happened, and so exploring those histories so we can like understand how things unfolded or how people have acted against the thing that's happening, which my assumption is like always like against different forms of violence and different forms of brutality, and how people navigate those situations and how they become political actors and what they end up doing and the strategies they form. So I think I'm always drawn to art that does that historical work. And I think for me, that like art in general and that form of art, like essentially is a form of study for me. I think that's how I see art. Um, and I think the way to go about change is really just having knowledge of what happened in the past, what worked, what didn't, how things are different, but how things are also kind of the same, or how these histories are connected.
And we talked, like when you were talking about your artistic interests a little bit, you both like you kind of compared um, your visual and auditory, I guess you could say, artistic interests. I was wondering if there are like different expressions and themes that you enjoy more in like one medium over another.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, I guess I could start with music. What I really enjoy about the kind of music that I like, but also the music that I make, is that I'm interested in sounds that are unfamiliar and unrecognizable and things that are very abstract. And that not only happens through different production techniques or forms of sound design, but I think maybe one thing that helps with that is also it's mostly auditory. Yeah, listening to music, listening to sound, even though like you can also like feel it in your body. Yeah, you can imagine like being next to a pair of like very powerful, really nice speakers and just like yeah, feeling what's happening in the body while you're listening to things. Um, but again, because it doesn't have that visual component and is mostly auditory, like in a way that also defies recognition and familiarity, which I am especially interested in. And then in terms of visual art, the kind of visual art that I'm interested in is also mostly abstract, or at least things that aren't representational, aren't figurative, don't really have the human form in it. Um, and I think maybe in terms of like 2D work, like that's what I'm interested in, things that are not representational or figurative and are abstract. And then in terms of sculpture and installation, I think I don't mind recognizing these objects, um, and whether they're transformed or not, or the degree to which they're transformed. But I think what is interesting to me is if that artist can essentially take that familiar thing out of its familiar context and put it in a new one. Um, and if they can, yeah, if they can do that and make me see the thing in a new way, I think that's like very compelling. Um, and how, and maybe also like how they put familiar objects like in relation to one another and then like suggest different connections or links by doing so, I think is interesting. So yeah, I guess I'm like maybe in terms of visual art, I'm like more open to recognition in a way versus like in music, I'm not at all.
Mhm. That's so fair. And then like we've mentioned it a few times throughout this conversation so far, but of course, like you do more than curation and programming, you're also an artist. And you've talked a bit about some of the artistic interests you have when it comes to creating your music, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your creation process.
Okay, I think it definitely, or at least recently, has started with a deadline. So I'm like, okay, cool, I have to make something now. Um, and then, okay, once the deadline is squared away and in the calendar, um, I usually just start to look for things online. Like I think I'm always starting a new project. Like I don't really like work on things for a long time. I kind of move on and always like to create new things, of course. So that usually starts with me going to the BBC Sound Library, which is like a nice resource for like free sounds. And I usually look for the ones that are related to electronics, like radio transmission or static, or more industrial things that yeah are related to some kind of like material or industry or like for example like textiles or other forms of production. And yeah, I pretty much just like save things that catch my eye initially, and things that I'm interested in, which yeah, are mostly like kind of abstract sounds. Like maybe like it is recognizable, like, oh, this sounds like a factory or like some kind of machine in a factory, but that's probably like the extent to the recognition, but you could also describe those sounds as something else. And so I just collect a lot of material from various sources. And then I use Ableton, so I bring the material in there, and then I kind of just start messing with it. And maybe that means like only using like a small snippet of a sound. So if the thing is like a minute long, I'm like using 10 seconds maybe. Um, and I guess like that is one way like that could happen. But I think what I've noticed is maybe at the core of my process is just exhausting the material. So maybe if I do have a minute long thing, or regardless of the length, like I'm trying to make so many different elements from it. Like maybe I'm like stretching it and adding a lot of effects such as reverb to kind of make like a pad of some kind or something that's more atmospheric. But maybe I'm using like the same element to have something that's like more sharp and striking and very short. Um, and maybe I'm using that same thing to make a repetitive element. So I'm really interested in dance music, so like loops and repetition and continuity are really important to me. And usually, like, once I feel like I've made everything I could possibly make from one element, um, I kind of move on to something else and do the same thing with other samples, and then just combine things that I think sound nice together, or yeah, pair nicely. And then I think for me, like, that process of manipulation, or like the manipulation itself, is like very crucial to my process. So like exhausting the material, processing it, um, making it sound unrecognizable, like I mentioned before. And then I think at the end, like, that's when the meaning of the piece kind of coheres for me. Um, and then I just try to like make sense of it. Like, okay, like what was I trying to say with this? Or what does it remind me of in some way?
Yeah. Are there any like meanings or themes that you've noticed you tend to be drawn towards when you create your work?
Yeah, probably abstraction. That's always the goal. I don't want my music to sound like real life. I want it to sound different. And I think that also comes from like all of the art that I engage with, whether it's visual art or film or writing. Like, I like things that are experimental, things that feel like they live elsewhere, things that show us what is possible that maybe we don't see in our everyday lives. So I think I tried to do that with my own music. Um, and in terms of like maybe themes, like everything I make sounds pretty like dark and dissonant or melancholic. Um,
And then I'm also curious, do you ever take your own like field recordings and then manipulate those, or is it primarily like sampling um elsewhere?
yeah, mostly sampling elsewhere. I have tried to take some field recordings, but maybe it's like difficult being in a city because you like, of course, no sound is isolated. Um, yeah, you're hearing so many different things at the same time. Um, but I think for me, whenever I try to do that, like, it really does sound like I'm in the city, and that's kind of like, I think, hard for me to start with, like, as material. Of course, you can try to like, yeah, grab little snippets that maybe can do that, the work that I want it to, but I find I'm more interested in, yeah, things that are online.
Mhm. I think it might be something interesting to take recordings from like an event in particular so it has like that focus, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like Hyde Square, like Boston's Latin Quarter,
Mm,
um, and some of the events they do, like these communal bomba events. Bomba
mhm,
is a Puerto Rican dance. And something like that I think could be really interesting, where you can take some of these clips where you can get some of like the sounds of people and community plus the music and the sound of dancing.
yeah, that's a good point.
So that could be like an interesting direction.
Yeah, totally. This is also making me think of, in my practice, I use a lot of modulation, um, and LFOs and mapping things to other things and kind of just having things like interact with each other or be influenced by like other track channels or other instruments or other samplers that are in the project, and kind of just like almost like seeing what happens. Like, of course there's like a lot of decision making, like I'm choosing the mapping and I'm choosing the things that I want to interact with each other, but I almost want them to do their own thing and kind of like see what happens. Um, which which is maybe, yeah, maybe why I'm like not in, or don't often take field recordings. I think I'm just like, yeah, maybe just like so interested in like sound design and like what happens, like, yeah, on the DAW and like in the box. But yeah, I don't know why I thought of that, but that was just like making me think of like, yeah, another important thing in my part.
That's so fair. The last question I had for you is about Boston. We've talked a bit how there is so much art and history, and also, like, specifically a lot of history of social change. I think everyone knows what Boston is famous for in a lot of ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know your thoughts on how you think that artists should leverage being in like such a unique scene that is Boston.
The artist should leverage this by going out to so many things since the city is so small in a way. So if you do that, maybe you can connect with the people that are interested in the same things that you are, maybe are working in similar ways. Um, People who are working on different projects. Um, yeah, and just like begin to surround yourself with the people that you want want to engage with, um, and learn from, and also share the things that you know about. And yeah, maybe since Boston is like a very historical city that has a lot of universities, like if you're interested in like a more like research based practice, like it could be like going to different libraries or institutions or archives, like if that's something that you're interested in. Um, yeah, and just like I guess like talking to people. That's always like it's so easy, but also so difficult to do and hard to remember to do. And also like it does take work. You do have to put in effort, but at the very least, at least you have met someone new and have found out what they're interested in.
I know I said that was the last question, but there is a sub question, so it
Cool.
counts. But I'm wondering, like, from your position as a director, curator, programmer, what your thoughts are on how artistic institutions as a whole, like, broadly play into platforming these artists and contributing to and enriching the scene. I was originally asking more, like, I was originally going to ask more about like platforming social change and community, like the kind of artistry that like UVA focuses on. So that's kind of the underlying direction of
Mhm.
how artistic institutions that don't necessarily exclusively or like explicitly focus on platforming engaged art, as I kind of refer to it, like how do they or how can they value this work and help platform artists that are like local and standing for whatever various engagements that they stand for.
Hmm. I think for me, maybe it comes down to a couple of things. One is just if you have the space and the resources, like use it. And yeah, think about the people who are around, um, and offering that opportunity to them and offering that opportunity to them. But I also think that like it is important to bring people who are outside of the city too. So we're not just like in our own echo chamber, seeing the same people and having the same conversations, but also just seeing what other people are doing, I think is really important. Um, and also, money is always the issue. So if you have the resources to just give artists money to do what they need to do, or give them like studio space and like just like create the conditions for them to like make their work, focus on their work, be valued for their work, be compensated to be able to continue doing this work, I think is also important. Yeah, I guess if we're talking about institutions working with artists, I think actually having it be a collaboration between the institution and the artist, but that can be challenging because an institution is an institution with so much money behind it and so many people working for it and people having different interests that are not always transparent and depending on the institution are probably very much connected to profit. Which is like, yeah, it's difficult to do, but I think if someone is an artist that wants to have those kinds of partnerships with an institution, I guess just being aware of what they can actually offer you and what they can actually do and what they're made for, and maybe just like being clear about those expectations.
I do have one follow-up question, which is I'm curious what your thoughts are on more like unconventional exhibition spaces. I'm thinking about I think it's technically Alston, Prolific's, the dispensary, how they have that smaller little art gallery. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on these smaller and like multi purpose, I guess you could say, spaces.
I think it's interesting to have different options for exhibiting and having these unconventional spaces. But what it's making me think of is like how this space like influences or shapes how you engage with the work and what your perception of the work is. Like in these unconventional spaces, and I think it really comes down to like how they're organized and like the layout of the place, but depending on the space, sometimes like the work can feel like an afterthought or more of a decoration, which if if you want decorations, then you got decorations and that's good. Like it's been a success, but I think yeah, you have to be balancing like a variety of factors, like how to give the work and the artist like their due and what they deserve and really showcasing the thing as best you can. Um, which is one thing. And maybe that's kind of a maybe not a limitation, but like a concern I would have about unconventional spaces. Like if they weren't built in mind or built with the idea of showcasing work in mind. However, if you're showing work in an unconventional space, maybe that also shows that one doesn't have to have like maybe a sterile white cube to show work. Like you can show things in different places. And maybe depending on what these spaces are, like you don't have to consider certain things. And you can break the rules almost because the space allows you to do that. And I think the other thing that it's making me think about is how the space might have a kind of idea of legitimacy tied to it. So like if you're showing your work like at a major institution, like you're like legitimized by the institution, right? Like you have the reach of the institution and a lot of people see the work and like you get name recognition and you get something, well you get yeah, an award or a recognition that you can then put on your like CV and then you get more opportunities potentially versus if you're showing it at a maybe like unconventional space that does not have that kind of recognition, even if they might have some kind of recognition based on a different audience. Like, yeah, will that give you more opportunities? Or yeah, how many people are you reaching if that's something that you're concerned about or hoping for? So I feel like, yeah, what all this comes down to is like the space, whether it's an institution or unconventional, like just offers like certain possibilities or limitations or certain freedoms or certain drawbacks. But as things like get more difficult or access to space becomes even harder, I can imagine like maybe these unconventional spaces, like even home spaces or like smaller DIY spaces, might become more important or necessary or utilized. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's always interesting how like space as an exhibit or gallery space can align with artists and their interests and trajectories. With that was actually my last question this time, I promise. That's all I had for today. And yeah, thank you for joining me.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
This episode of Iris FM was hosted and partially edited by me, Iris Martinez. Other editing by Leo Martinez, who also improvised the intro and outro of this episode.